There we go.
All right. Nice little intimate conversation. I'm going to just really quickly introduce Greer, G.R. Macallister tonight. She is one of our store's favorite authors, so we're very excited that she could be here tonight. And that you guys can be here, and that those tuning in online are here. Most of us know Greer from historical fiction. She's here tonight for a very exciting new book, her new series, SCORPICA, The Five Queendoms. So I'm going to end there. I'm just going to let you talk. So.
I'm in the business of writing, but also the business of talking.
Yes,
so
and you can
works
take
out
your
great.
mask off if you want to, Greer. If you're comfortable, you can.
If
Whatever you
everybody's
want to
cool
do.
with that, I'll go ahead and do it, especially with the people online. To make sure that everyone can hear me. And I have been a tour guide and an English teacher and a cheerleader, so I can make my voice heard, usually without too much trouble. But if I'm if I start drifting off, let me know, and so that I can change things. This is one of my first in-person events in a really long time, so I'm really glad to be in a room with people while I talk about the book and the series. And it'll be the first time that I'm reading from the book, so that'll be fun. So maybe we'll just start with that. I'll give you sort of the very high level SCORPICA overview, which is it's the first book in the matriarchal epic fantasy series called The Five Queendoms, and there are 500 years of unbroken peace between the queendoms until suddenly, for whatever reason, girls stop being born. Every child born in the queendoms is a boy, and then what happens after a year, 5 years, 10 years, if all you're used to is women in power and there may not ever be women again, what sort of havoc does that wreak? So there was actually yesterday with International Women's Day, there were a lot of people speaking about women in general, and there was a comment from Sheryl Sandberg saying, in light of some of the things happening in the world today, well, if women were in charge, there would be no war, which is definitely not the case. 100% no. Bless her heart. But yeah, so this is a whole book about how that's not it. There are some really nice women in this book. There are cinnamon rolls, and there are really, really lovely women, and there are people who would rather stab you than say hi. So so that's SCORPICA and the Five Queendoms, and I'm going to read not from the very beginning, but I'm going to jump ahead a little bit. But I will show you that there's a map, because I'm very excited about the map. And those of you who've read the Arctic Fury will know there was also a map in the Arctic Fury. So historical fiction does sometimes have maps also, but this was the first, I drew the Five Queendoms, I made them up, and then Saga Press, the imprint of Simon & Schuster that released the book, got an actual professional artist, thank goodness, to draw it and make it better instead of just my sort of outline, crayon kind of thing. So you see all the Five Queendoms there. So I will read, rather than the very beginning, I want to read you the bit, and the next time I do this, I will mark this page before I start talking.
Are we the first event?
It's my second event. Well, I did do one online. I did the after show for Friends in Fiction, which is a fabulous virtual event series. That was only 15 minutes, and 15 minutes is a whole different
And that was after B. Schwab, right?
Yes,
You guys were.
exactly. Yeah. You guys did you have her in person?
We did.
Oh, that's awesome. She's great. I haven't read Gallant yet. I did read, obviously, like literally a million other people. I read and loved Addie McGrew. That was one of my favorite books of the past 10 years. All right. I have found the page that I wanted to find. This is chapter 6. It's called The Drought of Girls. So this is, you get introduced to various characters. The book really rotates through a lot of different points of view. But it starts out sort of while girls are still being born, and then suddenly that stops, and this is the chapter where we talk about that. Only some disasters strike. Others roll slowly, rippling in wide, lush waves, creeping unnoticed as their poison spreads. Their victims awake one dawn to find not that disaster has struck, but that it has long since crept into their palates alongside them, nestled inside their clothes, settled itself to live upon their skin. It has dwelt unseen in their houses for days, weeks, months. They have already breathed in the disaster like air. So it was with the Drought of Girls. Logically, the scribes of the Bastion should have noticed it first. Ever since the Great Peace, it had been their duty to record every known birth in the Five Kingdoms. Seemingly endless lists of names, dates, and locations were written down in their vast library of record books, shelved forever. Scribes assigned to every nation discharged this duty faithfully. Yet these lists were initially scattered, kept in smaller logbooks, tucked into a pack, a knapsack, a pocket. These records might not make their way back to the Bastion for a full year. What was the rush for history? The junior scribe who transferred birth records into a central book saw a pattern, but said nothing, afraid the anomaly was in his work, not the facts themselves. It was in SCORPICA that the pattern became obvious first then, and at first it looked like good fortune. Trading away or selling newborn boys to other nations brought in goods, money, and food, and more boys meant more gain. Their stores of wine, for the first time, threatened to overflow the storage jugs. The counselor responsible for coin realized that, for the first time, she needed a second warrior to help her lift the chest. Quickly, there was more of everything, except newborns who would grow into warriors, the one resource they could not do without. In Arca, every village kept its own council, too concerned with survival to take notice of what villages across the miles might have or do. They mourned their own lack of girls, yes, but spoke to no one outside the village about it, not on the road, not at the river. The queen, Miriam, certainly could have figured it out if she cared to. She only noticed she'd heard no reports of all magic girls in a while, but that was all to the good. In her view, there were altogether too many all magic girls already. In Cestia, the farmers and bone burners had work to do. They gossiped when they met, but they met rarely. And their priest queen, the High Zara, did not concern herself with children. Priests of the Holy One were sworn to forego pleasures in honor of the celibate life their god had led after her consort descended to the Underlands. There were rites to plan and manage the nation's storehouses to maintain the god's standards to uphold. Life outside the walls of her temple palace remained just that, outside. For its part, Paxum was too far flung to put the pieces together. The senators were occupied with the things that always occupy senators: laws and rules, arguments and debates, jockeying for power and position. Their widowed queen had her own all-consuming concern, worrying as her infant son Paulus grew. Every day as she watched him learn to stand, walk, speak, she never lost sight of the clash that was to come when she insisted on making him the first ever king to rule the queendom. And so it went that the drought of girls spread across the Five Queendoms unheralded. It did not look like a disaster, not yet. To those who live day to day, it simply looked like life. So why this book, right? Why fantasy? Why any of this? Because I was puttering along just fine, writing historical fiction, had my niche, and when people asked, after I'd written The Magician's Lie, and then Woman 99, both sort of set in this 1850s to 1910 America, strong women sort of thing, they said, oh, do you think that you'll keep writing this sort of thing? And I said, sure. Like every idea I have is a historical fiction idea. So of course, one day I had an idea that was not a historical fiction. I actually had a couple of different ideas. It was interesting. This was before the Arctic Fury came out. So Woman 99 had been released and was out in the world. I was sort of pondering what I wanted to do next. I had 30,000 words, or a few chapters of the Arctic Fury. I had a domestic suspense idea, and I had the idea that somebody should write something like Game of Thrones, but more feminist and like not misogynistic and full of rape, all those things. So somebody should do that, right? Didn't think it was necessarily going to be me, but I talked to my agent and said, I have these 3 ideas. What do you think? And she said, you sound like you really want to write that fantasy book. I said, well, maybe. And she doesn't represent fantasy. So that was for her to say that, and for her to say, you do what moves you, instead of saying, well, I'm going to make more money if you do this. She did say don't go in the domestic suspense direction because everybody already was, and it was very saturated and hard to sell a book, and I was totally fine with that. But she said just explore, just start and see where things lead you. And I just disappeared into the book, and I had so much fun writing it. And people talk about sort of the world building process, and you're building worlds in historical fiction because none of us can travel to 1850s Chicago. None of us could be in the Civil War. None of us can, hang out with Kate Warren while she was saving Abraham Lincoln's life on his way to his inauguration. So you're still choosing details and pulling things together and constructing the world that the reader is going into. So people talk about it as a fantasy thing, as a sci-fi thing, and it absolutely is, but it's also very much a historical fiction thing. And any fiction, but particularly historical, because you're drawing that scene. You're taking people into an unfamiliar world. And it just happens to be a world that existed on this planet as best we can approximate it. That's the other thing, too, is a lot of historical fiction, you have to fill in imagination. We just don't know everything that we would like to know about these people and places and the time. So you're still making it up. That's why it's fiction. My historical fiction in particular, anyone who's read most of my historical fiction will tell you, is a little history and a lot of fiction. So I was very much in that vein, looking at history, but it really opened a lot of doors to move into fantasy. Not just because you can do magic stuff and there's a girl who sprouts wings and flies off. That is a thing that you can do in fantasy because you can do anything, literally anything, which is so exciting and kind of scary, but mostly exciting. And especially if you've been a historical fiction author and you've gotten emails and Goodreads reviews that say, oh, you can't, you did this, that never happened, nope, you can't do that. I got, the day Woman 99 came out, I got a very nasty email from someone who said, it is really terrible of you to perpetuate this myth that asylums were bad places because they did a lot of good. Which some of them no doubt did, but that's not the book that I was writing because it would be a very boring book. So, and talking with my fellow historical fiction authors, we're always getting, the corrections, or the mistaken corrections, which are also fun. No, shotguns didn't exist. Shotguns did exist, but, once the book is out in the world, it belongs to everyone. So take it and be suspicious of the production and marketing of commercial shotguns if you like, but book is the book. But with fantasy, you can send me an email that says, well, you show the Scorpicans hunting red squirrels in the fall, and they're not native to Scorpica. So you can send me those emails, but I made up Scorpica, and I say that they hunt red squirrels in the fall, and that's just something that they do. So it's freeing, right? It's wide open, which again is both wonderful and scary. So I did a lot of this world building. I actually did a lot of it with my husband, and this was sort of early pandemic times. One of us had to be in the house with the kids in the evening, even if they were asleep. And so one of us would stay in the house, and the other one would go out for a walk, and we would just get on the phone and the earbuds and just talk for hours about this world. And he's got an economics brain and a history brain and sort of a rigorous way of looking at things. So we'd say, oh, well, what about this? Well, what about the Babylonian goddess Inara? Let's look her up. Let's see if we can pull, is there something about her journey to the underworld that could be interesting here? Is there anything from Minoan Crete that would be interesting here? And really just throw these ideas back and forth. So in the process of developing the first book of the Five Queendoms, I actually initially wrote a character in every queendom and had you following 5 different stories that were actually completely separate stories until the end. And my agent who read it said, okay, we got to talk about this, because while, if you have a book that's that sprawling and that disconnected, and in her case, and the other readers who were reading it at the time, they said, look, this I was really interested in every character as I was reading about them, but then I forgot
Are you close?
who they were by the time I got back to them again. So so I worked through it with her. I narrowed it down, and we sort of went through the process of trying to turn it from a draft into an actual book. And those of you who've heard me talk before know that my writing process is so messy. It is just terrible. I just throw stuff onto the page. And most of my writing is rewriting. I go back and I fix and I change. And there's a major character in this book who was one line in the first draft. I talk about what happens, and I'm not going to give it away, but I referred to this queen who extended her life by doing something in particular. And so the readers at that were like, okay, you're not going to tell us the story about that lady? So as I was revising, I'm like, well, she's sort of part of this stream with this other character, so maybe let's write a little bit more about her. And then more about her, and then more about her, and now she's one of the most important characters in the whole thing. So you can discover that in the writing process if you have a messy writing process like I do. I am jealous of the people who can discover it during the outlining process and actually figure it out before they write it down. But I am not one of those people, or at least I have not been so far. The only book of mine that did not go through at least 5 drafts was The Arctic Fury, which is kind of crazy because that book has 13 points of view and 2.5 timelines. And maybe that's why it made the most sense and had the fewest major revisions, because there are only a certain number of ways that you can arrange 13 different women's stories of the same event, especially if some of those women die between the beginning and the end, and they have to have their chapter before their death. And there's there's all sorts of fun stuff, and I'd be happy to answer questions about any of my books, including The Arctic Fury. But mostly you're here to listen to this one. So it was a very messy process. There was lots and lots of rework. There's actually someone who was a major character in an earlier draft that had to be excised completely in order to get this more focused. She may end up coming back in book 3. And there's definitely somebody that you don't get to find out much about here that everyone's asking about. She's going to show up in book 2. So that's the great thing about writing a series, which I've never done before. The great thing about writing a series is those, first of all the research you do and all the world building gets to stay useful. And you've got, you've got people get invented. There's a chance that those people will come back and you can use them. And if you're not writing a series, you might use them in a different book, but it's a lot easier to just say, oh, okay, well, the Hajara, we're not going to talk about her yet, but we will talk about, there's a chance to talk about her in the next book or the book after that. Or, God willing, in Creek Don't Rise, books after that and after that. So hopefully, I'm hoping this will be a 5-book series. Right now it's contracted for 3. And somebody asked me at my last event, well, what makes the difference? How do they decide whether it's going to be 5 books? And I said, that kind of depends on how books 1 and 2 do, largely. Because by the time I get to book 3, I need to know. For my sake and for yours. We need to know whether that's going to be the end of it or whether that's, continuing on to the next. So far, loving series writing. It's a lot of fun. It's a great experience. It is also kind of tight to do a book a year, especially when you're doing other things like momming and having a job in other areas, and pandemics and whatnot. So where I am with it now is book 2 has been submitted to my editor. I'm going to get edits back from them. And book 2 should be out this time next year. So there should be, hopefully, a constant flood of queendoms coming at you for the next several years at least. So probably I will be back here.
Yeah.
One more time. So Other than that, I think I wanna know what you wanna know. So if we've got questions from online, if there are questions that you have, I am happy to talk again, like about any aspect of this book, series writing, being a writer, the historical fiction stuff, anything at all.
You mentioned, the amount of time that you spent trying to do the world building.
Yeah.
How do you compare that to all of the research time that you must spend when you're doing your historical fiction books? Was it, like so much more work to create a new world, or is it, obviously it's very different kind of work, but how do you compare them?
It's, I had sort of a process set up for historical fiction that I really preferred to do a ton of research and then just stop the research completely and write a draft and then go back and do the kind of more detailed research. So like for Girl in Disguise, I read about the Pinkertons, I read about Kate Warren herself, and sort of figured out the types of cases the Pinkertons were working on at the time, wrote the draft, got it, got my agent's input, got my editor's input, got through all that. And then once I knew that that was the shape of the draft and those scenes that were in the book were going to stay in the book, that's when I went and got a map of 1856 Chicago and looked up the street names. Like I figured out during the 5 years that it took me to write The Magician's Lie, I figured out that researching and writing at the same time is really hard for me personally. That I can't just stop writing and go research a fact and come back because it'll take me 3 hours to research that fact and I will have not written a single word other than hat. That day there's a lot of hat research in historical fiction. Very few hats in this book. There's some circlets, there's some helmets, but very, very, very few hats. So, but that's what people. I'm watching The Gilded Age, which it's amazing how they have all these amazing actors who are just completely wooden. It's like the first Star Wars prequel where they take all these really talented people and then just make them like paper dolls. But anyway, the costumes are fabulous. So I think a lot of us are watching The Gilded Age in order to see gorgeous costumes. And I think there are people who read historical fiction who would be very disappointed if you're not describing the hats and the gowns and what people are wearing. So I feel like that's part and parcel of historical fiction. You've gotta have that in there. Fantasy series like this, you gotta have some sword fights. If there aren't sword fights, people are gonna be disappointed. So I did put a few of those in there. So very long answer, circling around to your question. So the research I would do, research, then writing, then research. World building for fantasy, there was a chunk of world building, but I couldn't help but build as I was writing too, because there's the stuff I didn't know until I got into the scene. I'm like, oh wait. And even then, the world building never stops, because even in copy edits, and the copy editor would flag, I'm trying to think of an example. Well, it wasn't something the copy editor flagged, but it sort of came to me. I was, writing and I'm trying to describe all the things, and describing somebody's hair is silky. And I'm like, do they have silk in this world? They don't have silk in this world, so I can't say that it's silky if they don't have silk. So we're gonna have to change that. And then it was interesting also figuring out all of writing the profanity was super fun because it's one of the ways that you learn about a culture and society is what they swear by. They're swearing by the gods, very common. Interjections that have something to do with bodily functions in all of their many forms. And so, especially because it's a female default world, it's a matriarchy, it always has been, it's always been women in charge, that affects some of what people swear by and what they say. So, so that was fun, but I would run into things all the time. I think I was almost in copy edits when I realized there's, on the very first page, there was a mention of a prince. And I had gone through and taken out, like if there was a sorcerer, she was a sorcerer. A priest was a priest, whether it was a man or a woman. There are no priestesses, there are no goddesses, because if it's a female default world, you don't have to tack on an ending to qualify something. It's just, she's a sorcerer, she's a priest. The gods, there are male gods and female gods, but they're all just gods. There's no gods and goddesses. And so I had gotten rid of those. There was a lioness, and I'm like, oh no, how do I do this? Like, okay, she's a mother lion. That works out. But I had not caught prince because it doesn't have any SS ending. But how, if you have princes, then you have princesses. So now he's a kingling. And there's kinglings and queenlings, and that's how we deal with the children of monarchs. But there's so much stuff that's just that's ingrained when you're working basically in a new language, in a new culture, in a world that you invented. The world building never ends, because you're still going through it at all times. But the great thing was with the research, because I did pull a lot from history to build these different societies from history and myth, but I could be a total magpie about it. I'm like, oh, okay, I like this Greek thing, and I like this Babylonian thing, and I like this Turkish thing, and I could just sort of do those without having to say, oh, okay, well, this is off limits because it's not authentic to the period or the place. The place is everywhere, the period is any time.
Whatever you want it to
It's
be.
whatever I want it to be. It's so fun. Yeah.
I was going to ask you about the profanity, but since you've gone there already, I do have some online questions. So, and I'll just go with the one that kind of continues on what you're talking about. What was the first cool world building detail that came to you? Something that doesn't necessarily impact the plot, but it's a cool thing that you know about the world.
Cool thing that I know about the world. The very first thing, after I decided it was going to be a matriarchal world, the first thing that I thought of was, well, what's the worst thing that could happen in a matriarchal world? And that's where the drought of girls came from, to just say, okay, well, you rely on girls, so you're not going to have them anymore. And obviously any fantasy or sci-fi book with a plot like that, if you're going to eliminate normal childbearing, you've got to have a long-term solution for it. But especially at this level of technology, which is sort of an ancient Roman, ancient Greek sort of level of technology, you only have so many ways to get things done. So, but I wanted it to become a crisis, to say, okay, well, this is going to throw everybody into turmoil. And the idea is, even after it's over, because I, without spoilers, say that it does at some point end. I won't say if it's in this book or not, but it does end. And even after that is done, you then have repercussions. You can't just turn the faucet back on and everything's as it was. So I wanted to take the matriarchal world that has known pretty much nothing but peace for 500 years and mess it up. So that was big. That was sort of the very beginning of how it came together.
I have another one, unless anybody here wants to. Okay.
So when you're world building, how do you keep it straight? Do you have like an encyclopedia you've written for yourself? Do you have like a dictionary? Do your editors have it? To your point of like, oh, I invented this thing and I gotta make sure I keep it straight for all 5 books. Like, how do you keep that straight?
I need to get better at it. That is the answer. So I am not organized enough. I do use Scrivener, and for those of you who are writers, some people write in Scrivener and use it to keep their research straight. I just use it for outlining and research, to sort of have a place to store things. And I started out very organized about it, but as the successive drafts rolled on into like 5, 6, 7 drafts in, I lost track of it and I stopped keeping it up. And that is why my copy editor, who saves, she had to point out, oh, you have 2 characters with the same name, because I had given it, I liked the name Aleph, so I'm like, oh, okay, well, I used it, and then I forgot that I used it, and I used it again. And luckily, it was very easy to fix, because they were both minor characters, and B, the book hadn't been published yet, and I wasn't stuck with having 2 Alephs. So yeah, as the first book made its way through the process, I had to get some help sort of straightening things out in terms of timeline and how old everybody is at different points in the book, because first book covers almost 15 years worth of action. So there was a lot of how old is this person and how old is if she's that old and how old is she? So I needed some help keeping that straight. I have since had help building a series Bible. So big spreadsheet. I'm a Microsoft Word person. I think most writers are, but Microsoft Excel definitely has its advantages. So I now have a massive spreadsheet with names, places, gods, flowers, animals, like pieces of jewelry, any character's physical description. Which one of them did I say like had a face shaped like a spearhead? Like, okay, which was she? And I need to make sure that I don't use that description again, because there are only so many ways to describe people, and I keep having to find new ones. Because these are all, it's a very homogenous population, so they all have dark eyes and dark hair. Everybody does. And they might have shorter hair, they might have longer hair, but you're not going to be able to say, oh, it's the blonde one, oh, it's the, with a redhead. You have to say, it's the woman whose nose looks like it's been broken twice. It's the woman with the wide shoulders. It's, so, and especially because it's so many female characters, it's not entirely women, but it's predominantly women. And so you're going to have trouble keeping people straight. That's epic fantasy for you. That was part of, not my design that people would get confused, but my design that there would be a huge cast, that it would just be so many characters, and that it would be predominantly women in this world. Just because that's not how fantasy was when I was growing up. It's changed a lot, especially in the past 5-10 years. But I really wanted it to be this female-dominated world, this female-dominated cast. So you are gonna meet a lot of women, many of whom make it to the end of the books, which is another thing you can do with a large cast that you can't do with a small.
Can I say it took me a while to, because I'm slow. Queendoms, kingdoms, sorry, that just took me a moment to grab that.
Well, it's interesting because the number of interviews that I've done and reviews that I've read, that, it says the 5 queendoms right there. Every single mention in the book is queendoms, but it's so ingrained in people. They say, oh yeah, she runs that kingdom. No, she doesn't, but I don't correct people every single time. But it is the default, because in our world, even kingdoms, when they're run by women, are still called kingdoms. There are no queendoms that we know of. So it's sort of interesting to think about.
And you had an online question asking if you have a favorite of the queendoms.
Interesting. So because I had to go through and thin the herd a little bit, because there were 5 different characters being followed, one from SCORPICA, the Bastion, Arca, Paxson, and Cestia. We went in the first iteration when my agent Elizabeth was helping me. We took it down from 5 to 3 of the queendoms getting focused on, and I rewrote with that in mind, and then read through it again, and we talked about it again, and she said it's got to go down to 2. And that was really hard, saying goodbye to the third sort of deep dive on queendom, which was Cestia. So Cestia is mostly agrarian farmland. It isn't divided into like a divergent type of like, oh, all of this type of people live here, and this type of people live here, and this type of people live here. It's the queendoms serve those purposes. Like Paxson has the diplomats. That doesn't mean that literally everybody in Paxson is a diplomat. There are people at trading posts, and there are bandits, and there are people just living their lives in all 5 of the queendoms. But Cestia has a lot of the farmland. So there are a lot of farmers, there are a lot of shepherds, and it's run by basically a version of the Vestal Virgins of Rome. So they're all celibate priests, queens who run the show. And so I was following along with one of those, and she makes some really questionable decisions that I can't tell you about because they'll probably be in book 3. But Cestia is the queendom that I really want everybody to get deeper into, and you don't have the opportunity to do that in book 1. So I don't know if it's my favorite in the sense of like, it's the best, like I would live there, because I wouldn't. Most of these queendoms have some problems, but it is the one that I'm most looking forward to introducing readers to, or giving readers more of a tour of.
I have more online if you guys don't want to.
Anybody else in person? Okay. All right, we're going to virtual.
Is there a publishing date for book 2? I am not patient and want to continue as soon as possible.
First of all, thank you. Yes, I too am very eager to have book 2. And my British editor, so this is the first book that I've had in my 4 works of historical fiction and now fantasy. This is the first one that's had a simultaneous US and UK release. And so the way that it works, at least in our case, is US editor is the one who edits and helps make revisions and shape the book. And then there's a UK editor who acquired it for that publishing company, and a publicist in the UK publishing company, and they're like super involved. But they haven't gotten to read even the first draft of book 2 yet. So I hear from them frequently. I mean, like, where's book 2? Because they know they'll get to see it before anybody else does. After this one person gets through it, and I actually get those edits put together. So there is not a firm date. I was told a couple of weeks ago that it will probably be March of 2023. So the plan was to do it basically once a year, and this one was February 22nd, so it was the very end. And especially those of you who follow book stuff know publishing dates right now. Woo! Like, oh, it's gonna come out in May, and now it's November. Oh no, wait, now it's next May. Like, yes, that's my favorite story, honestly. Well, if I were Melissa Clark and it were my cookbook that fell in the ocean, I would not like that story. Like, in publishing, like, we've heard everything before, and with booksellers too, like everything. Oh, it was delayed because of this, it was delayed because of that. It was delayed because the books fell in the ocean. Like, they slid off of the ship and they fell in the ocean. And it's really hard to get stuff printed right now. So they couldn't reprint enough of this cookbook. There's one other. It was hers and one other.
Tiger.
Yeah. Oh, one of the Tiger Mom.
No, that's not one. It's in my cart. There also
Okay.
was
But
a cyclone, a typhoon that knocked sunk a ship that had books on it.
So yeah, so those books are not coming out when they said they were going to come out, and a lot of
Jillian Cantor. Someone just posted that's who the other person was.
oh, was it Jillian Cantor's? Okay, yeah, she just had, didn't she just have the Gatsby one? Beautiful Little Fools. Oh no, I'm getting confused between different historical fiction people. Okay, yeah, so delays will happen, things will happen, hopefully not ship-related things or typhoon-related things, but barring anything like that, we're projected to still stay on the book-a-year trajectory for now, which, yay!
I want to know about the cover design, especially the British one is awesome. They're both beautiful. So just
Yeah, let's talk about that. Very different. The British one is like this dark blue, and it has a scorpion. And they did a really good job. It was a different publisher, different designer, but my UK cover for The Magician's Lie also did a really good job of pulling things from the story and putting them in there. So the scorpion on the front of the UK version of SCORPICA also has a snake, a blue snake entwined with it, and some cherries. So once you read the book, you'll see what those all have to do with. And this one, it's subtle, but the artist who did it, this is the first time I've ever had original artwork commissioned for my book too, which is amazing. And so Nivo did this, and Victo Nye. Victo Nye, who did this totally amazing hammer for the Neil Gaiman's Greek mythology. And so when they said she was going to do my book, they showed me that. Thank you. Can't wait to see what she comes up with. So I actually changed a little bit of the book to make this cover possible. So they said, what's an object? We want to go with an object. We don't want it to be like a person with a sword. We don't want it to be just like landscape. We want it to be an object. What object can we put on the front? And I said, well, there's this birthing blade during a very important childbirth scene in SCORPICA that could work. I guess it would be interesting if, like, in the course of this conversation is when it really came to me. I'm like, oh, well, I guess it'd be interesting if the handle were like scorpion shaped instead of just being, it wasn't described that way at that time. But wouldn't it be cool if it was scorpion shaped and then it would be a blade, and then you would get the sense that there's some violence in this book and also some scorpions, and it would be interesting. So they agreed to it. I rewrote it to match that. And so you've got your scorpion here. You've got sort of these two areas that kind of represent a couple of different queendoms. And what I didn't notice as much on the ARC and on the online version that you see in the hardcover version, besides it's just so nice, it's so lovely. This shadow really, it just makes it pop. It just like lifts off the page. And so I'm in love with it. So, and actually right now we're talking about the cover for book 2. So I know what book 2 will probably be called. I know what color it's probably going to be. I know what object is going to be on the front, but that's all I know. And then they just present it to me, and then I say yes. That's a big part of my job. Yes. So they engaged her for all 3 that are under contract now. We'll continue.
Given the world building freedom you described, do you think you will return to the relative constraints of historical fiction? And if you do, have you learned anything from just the sheer discipline and Excel spreadsheet of it all that you would take back to historical fiction? Just something new you learned as a writer?
It's a good question. So I definitely, I do have another historical fiction idea that is percolating. I have found a woman from history that I think everybody should know about. And so I'm working on that. I didn't quite finish my agent story. So my agent, who does not represent fantasy, gave me her blessing, because she's magical. She gave me her blessing to find an agent who does fantasy. And it turned out that a different agent who had offered on my first book, but you can only have one for any individual book. So she had offered on that book. I went with Elizabeth instead. But in the meantime, that person has become like an amazing fantasy agent. She's actually V. Schwab's agent, Holly Root. And so I reached back out to her and I said, hey, remember you liked my book and we weren't working together, but now I want to do fantasy and I have this book. Would you like to represent it? And so she read it and loved it, and now we work together. So I had to have some contracts rewritten to make it very clear that anything that's historical fiction, I work with Elizabeth. Anything that's fantasy, I work with Holly. If I start writing another genre, cats, dogs, chaos, who knows what's going to happen. But those 2 categories are fully locked down. So, so if I have historical fiction, so my contract for this said that I could not release another historical fiction work before this came out, which I have successfully done. I did not produce historical fiction in the past year, but I'm percolating. I have an idea, so I'm working on that. And of course, publishing, how long it's going to take. It's a percolating idea. Even if we sell it on proposal, it's going to be a year or so. So probably I will be here next year pointing at a totally different book and saying, I still haven't produced any historical fiction in the meantime, but I may have produced it and it may just not have come out by then. But I think what I will take back to historical fiction, 2 things. One is I've already taken to historical fiction some of what I've learned writing a book like this, because I wrote the first couple of drafts of this before I wrote the Arctic Fury. So that's one of the reasons the Arctic Fury has 13 points of view and 2.5 timelines and is a bit more sprawling than my previous work. I think I just wanted to be going in that direction, so I took it as far as I could in historical fiction, but I wanted to write, that book is what it is because I had written Woman 99, which is set in an insane asylum and very claustrophobic and very focused. And I wanted to write something bigger. So I wanted to write an adventure, which is what I did with the Arctic Fury. And I wanted to have a lot of different characters to follow in an ensemble cast rather than focusing on one woman's story. So I did that in the Arctic Fury. That gave me a break from writing this, and then I was able to come back to it with fresh eyes. But at this point, I feel like what I'm going to take to the next work of historical fiction is it'll be kind of a relief to just keep track of one person. So I think when I go back to, I think my next work of historical fiction will be a first-person, single point of view, very focused, kind of like Girl in Disguise, which is it's just Kate, and it's just chronological. Starts at the beginning, goes through, then it stops. Like that's what some people want, it's what some stories need. Some stories can only be told that way, whereas some stories can only be told in this like massive kaleidoscopic thing. Technical term.
I was gonna say expanse, but
Yes, experience. I was joking with somebody before, this is one of my Zoom tops that I bought when I was doing virtual events. And so I really had to think about actually what I was going to wear on the bottom half. But what you cannot appreciate as much when you're only seeing me from here on up is the sleeves on this thing. They're just massive. So there, you all got to enjoy it. And the virtual people got to enjoy it too because they're sitting in front of the bed.
Sure.
Yeah, it is. With a little color, not like Jerry.
that's it, fun.
All right, another online question. You referenced the characters as a cast. Any chance there are renewals yet for a dramatization of the book?
Always fingers crossed. Always fingers crossed. So I've been lucky enough to work with the same film and TV agent, despite the shift in literary agents. So I work with someone at CAA who has managed to do amazing things with the rights to my books. And she is taking this one out right now. They used to do it a lot more in advance, and now it seems like the trend is going more towards when the book comes out to take advantage of the publicity that it gets right when it comes out, sending the book out to people who read. And it has already been rejected by like really famous people. So that's always fun. Like when this person says, well, the story wasn't for me, but I enjoyed the reading. I'm like, you enjoyed it. You know, so I am kind of, even though I forget. Like, but it's still good. So it's, I've been really, really excited about that. The book of mine that's closest to actually getting made is Woman 99, which they just renewed the option on. So Nina Dobrev and Made Up Stories, which is Bruno Papandreou's company, are working on adapting that for TV. So I'm really hoping that we get it there. Again, I've been crossing my fingers a lot, but I'm a writer, so we have to. I'm trying to think if there's anything else that I want to talk about. Yes.
If you had to be born into one of the 5 queendoms, which before the Drought of Daughters, which would it be, and would your answer change after the Drought of Daughters?
Okay, interesting. I think that Arca's pretty cool because that's where you get magic. And I think it would be the same. I think I would probably like to be an Arca regardless, because I would like to see what kind of gift I got. So the way that I've set up magic here is every woman born in Arca has some kind of gift that manifests sometime during her first 5 years or so. And it falls into one of 6 categories: mind, body, air, earth, fire, and water. Good, I remembered it. That's the kind of thing I gotta write down though. You can't mess that up. So every woman has a gift in one of those 6 areas, but it could be big, it could be small. Like your water gift could be, you can, I was gonna say stop a leaking faucet, they don't have faucets. So, maybe you could snap your fingers and the water in a pail would boil. Or you might be able to move the ocean. Like, it's somewhere between those 2 poles. There's also all magic, and all of the queens of Arca have always had all magic, which, as the name implies, has elements of all 6 of those. So I would just want to see what I got, that applies regardless of whether or not there are girls born. Things become the story that you're following in ARCA is largely about the queen and sort of her machinations to hold on to power and to make sure that nobody else tries to take over. And I'll leave that. You gotta read the book.
There's another online. How do you approach each draft? Do they start from scratch each time?
Thank goodness, no. So every draft that I do, I write, you hear of people writing longhand. I'm not one of those people. There's this phenomenon of people writing books on their phones also, which I respect so much, and I never would. The only time I write on my phone is if I wake up in the middle of the night and I have I need, wisp of the soul wrapped in shadow or something. There's some line that I want to remember, or there's some name that I want. Oh shoot, I never named that person Christabel. I meant to name that person Christabel. So I type in the night, in the dark, and it's usually not even close to what I'm thinking, but I at least have some record of it because otherwise I won't remember. But there are longhand writers, there are phone writers. Most of us are laptop writers. I'm a laptop writer. So I will produce a draft. I'd love to edit on screen. I edit as I go. I edit constantly. I save the work every single day with a different name just to keep everything. But I do at some point in the process, I have to print it out and edit longhand and write and mark up and cross out and do that kind of stuff, and then transfer those edits back into the file. So I will do that as part of my process. But when I'm doing big changes, like when I had to, just rip out entire chapters, rip out entire plot lines and people, that was all online. I would not have been able to just take the paper and throw it away.
I want to know about, so I follow you on social, and you have been writing outside in the cold.
Yes.
Was that something that you did before the pandemic, or is that a pandemic thing?
Writing outside of the home, I always did, but writing outside, no. Writing outside was definitely a pandemic phenomenon. And so for the first quite a while, we didn't have babysitters, and so I was writing in the home because I was always at home. We were all, always at home for a while. But once things started to free up, I could get a babysitter in the home. But then, okay, if I'm not at home, where am I going? Where can I go? Used to go to coffee shops, can't go to coffee shops. So once things opened up enough that outdoor seating was an opportunity, was available, I really took a tour of the entire city, just oh, I'm going to sit outside at this coffee shop on 14th Street, or I'm going to sit outside at this, restaurant near my house. And I got fingerless gloves, which were great. And then for Christmas, my parents got me even better fingerless gloves. Thanks, Mom. And yeah, just pulled on my layers and typed away. And the MacBook seems to have held up pretty well, despite the it's just the rain is the real problem. The rain is hard. Although there are some covered, I know where all the covered stuff is. And the problem, was even worse than the cold, and I don't think it shows up as much on Instagram because it's Instagram and everything's happy. The mosquitoes in DC. There was a Chipotle near me that had perfect, very quiet, nobody ever came. I could just buy one thing and stay there for 4 hours, and it was great, except that there were mosquitoes. So I would have my giant Diet Coke and my burrito bowl, and then my mosquito spray that just constantly, because DC summer, it's also 95 degrees, so I'm in shorts. I gotta do that thing. So yeah, so I've been experiencing the world, the outdoors, the great or not so great outdoors, because that was the only way that I was getting writing done, was to be able to focus outside. And so now I have a few options for inside, but it's warming back up again. I'm going to be back outside and writing there.
Sorry, go ahead.
Well, it just occurred to me that when you described you and Jonathan would get on the phone when we take a walk to talk over ideas and everything. I used to see you read and walk all the time. Yes. In busy, crowded DC streets and sidewalks. It's good to know that you also write and walk now.
And that she's safe after doing that.
Yes.
Right. Well, and this is some number of years ago when books were paper only, like, and so I would be walking to the bus on 15th Street, like walking and reading and like glancing around.
So
Take it all the way to the
her
bus.
friends would see her now and then and not want to interrupt, but also not want to take her eyes off in case she stepped off
Right.
the curb.
So call out to me because I can hear.
Is your first book that came out in hardback first? Because
No. Arctic Fury was
yes.
paperback original. So the other three were all hardcover and then paperback. So that was an interesting experience for me having to be just paperback last year because that was December 2020. So I was used to I was writing a book every 2 years, so it would be a hardcover release and then so every spring I had something. It was either a hardcover release or a paperback release, and then Arctic Fury was just a paperback release, but then there was this. So
yeah, I mean, we see a lot of, the paperback release only is something that there is so much more of.
yeah,
And then occasionally you'll see hardcover and paperback out on the same day, which confuses everyone.
right. Well, this pointing to it like it's the Arctic Fury, but it's not. The Arctic Fury was a paperback release, but there were hardcovers made, like for libraries and stuff, but they were in the system, so people were ordering them. So I think I even saw some hardcovers
I think
here,
you
even
did,
though it's
yeah.
on the shelf.
I think so.
Paperback, but
Well, I know we have some people who want to get books signed.
yeah.
I probably want to chat with you.
Fine.
Do you have any, how do you feel about pictures and things like that in this pandemic world? We just want to make sure that
I'm
you're
good.
comfortable.
You guys all had your cards checked.
Okay. Okay. Thank you so much. You are awesome.
Thank you.
You're a good one. Thank you, people. What type of